All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I am Emily Freitag. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Instruction Partners, and I'm so glad to be joined today by Dr. Jason Grissom. Jason, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone.
Um, and Jason is at Vanderbilt University, and we are excited to share some of the findings from a recent qualitative study that we did at Instruction Partners with Dr. Grissom's advising, as we have really a conversation about what do we know about how principals perceive their role as instructional leaders, and what do we know about the impact of principals, and what will it take to support role clarity in the principal role. Quickly, Instruction Partners is a nonprofit organization that is focused on strengthening instructional leadership in schools, school systems, and states to ensure teachers have the support they need to improve learning experiences with attention to students of color, students experiencing poverty, multilingual learners, and students with disabilities. And so we have been in operation for 9.5 years. Um, I often say we kind of have come in the front door of improving math and literacy and science instruction, but we end up in the kitchen talking about principal role clarity because so many roads lead to that path. And so we took up this project after observing that in so many of the partners we were working with, there was an instinct that principals must be the instructional leaders of their schools, and yet very different interpretations of what that means. And that had real implications for kids, and it had implications for teachers. And so as we really patterned this challenge, my first call was to Dr. Grissom, who both had recently written the meta study for the Wallace Foundation's report on principals, and as someone that I knew when I was at the Tennessee Department of Education ages ago, to ask him questions about what is known in research and what is not to inform the design of what we were then going to study. So as that conversation unfolded, we will start there, and I will hand the mic to Jason to tell you what we do know at a high level. You will have an opportunity to also ask him direct questions after his portion before we go on to the findings from this paper. So Jason, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. So, as Emily said, I've studied school leadership for a long time, and so when Emily and I were having that first conversation, we were talking about, well, what is known about the principal role, and I'm just going to start there and do a little stage setting. So, I was the lead author of a report for the Wallace Foundation that came out a few years ago that tried to synthesize the research that's been done in the field over about the last 20 years about the impacts of principals on students in their schools. And the top line finding of that is that principals just they really matter a lot. They matter a lot for student achievement. They matter a lot for other kinds of outcomes we care about, like student absenteeism and teacher turnover. And we have really good research that makes that linkage. And so um, we part of what we did in that study was really try to synthesize across the highest quality studies using the best available statistical methods to say what's the impact of having a good principal on student achievement specifically. And the answer is when you look across these studies, which in total aggregate over about 22,000 principals in different contexts and different districts, different school types, and uses, as I said, advanced methods to tease out the role of the principal. The conclusion is that having a high quality principal is really, really essential to getting high quality outcomes. And when we think what is the magnitude, because I think that's one of the benefit of what we did is to really be able to say, well, how much do they matter? if you take this as a distribution of principal effectiveness as a way of trying to illustrate this, and so, people who are on the left-hand side of this graph, people who fall on the left-hand side, those are people who are, uh, uh, let's say less strong in terms of raising student achievement. People on the right-hand side would be people who are on the sort of the stronger side of that distribution. And what we find is, most principals are in the middle, so the bulk of people are sort of, by definition are at the average. So the studies that we synthesize show that if you move to below average principals, so say a principal who's at the 25th percentile in that distribution, and you could instead move them to be at the 75th percentile. So move someone who is below average to moving them to be above average. The impact on kids would be about 3 months of learning in both math and reading. So that's really, really significant. It's not as large as the individual teacher's effect. Individual teachers have larger. If you did the same kind of exercise for teachers, you'd find the individual teacher is having a bigger impact on kids, which is what you'd expect because they're closer to children in the classroom. But the real kicker for principals is that the principal's effect is not just limited to one classroom. It's over all of the kids in a school. Right, so the average elementary classroom, for example, is about 25 kids, but the average elementary school is about 425 kids. And so that impact, I think, is big, but it's also big in magnitude, but also big in scope. And so that's just a way of illustrating that the impacts are large. And so that was one of our big findings. Now, if you showed up to a webinar to thinking about principles, I probably didn't need to convince you that principles were important, but they are. And the second part of what we did was to try to say, well, what do we know from empirical research about what makes someone effective, right? What differentiates the people who are great at raising student achievement outcomes and those who are less strong? So this is a figure from the report that summarizes the findings there. And I'm going to focus in on the middle piece of this, but just to say something about the bottom. The big, we looked at what skills were associated with being able to raise student achievement. The big finding there is that the skills that principals require are pretty diverse, and they range instructional skills, which we're going to focus on here, but not just instruction skills for improving classroom instruction, but also people skills. So human organizational development skills, relationship skills, and also organizational management skills, like the kinds of skills you need to lead a complex organization, even if it wasn't a school, right? The same kinds of skills that you would need, data use, strategic thinking, and so forth, that you need to run a nonprofit or run a store or run lots of kinds of complex organizations. What I want to focus on is the middle piece of this graph, which is what those skills are supporting. And those skills are supporting what we call 4 domains of behavior, domains of practice. These are the 4 areas that the research literature identifies as being most clearly linked to school and student outcomes. And so I'll say what they are, and I'm going to pull out one of them. All right, so from left to right, the first one is engaging in instructionally focused interactions with teachers. And that one is the close interaction with teachers around classroom instruction. So this is things like observation, coaching, giving feedback using data. The second one is building a productive climate. So building a climate that protects the core business of teaching and learning. So these are school climates that are, marked by good communication, trust, feelings of self-efficacy. Like we're all in this together and we can make a difference in students' lives. The third one is what we call facilitating collaboration and professional learning community. This is about adults in buildings having the capacity to work together and how they work together to improve student outcomes. And the fourth one is managing personnel and resources strategically. So this is using resources like money, people, time to pursue the school's goals. And where we see that principals are strongest in each of these 4 areas, that's where we see the schools that are most clearly sort of advancing in terms of student outcomes and school outcomes more broadly. So if I pull out just this first one, because this is the one that we're going to talk about most clearly in the study that Emily is going to come into in just a second, this is in engaging in instructionally focused interactions with teachers. Again, this is principals' work with their leadership teams around improving instructional effectiveness. And so the pieces that we pull out are things like data use, including conducting high quality observations. So being able to recognize high quality from low quality instruction, to be able to do that noticing and that recognition for purposes of giving feedback that are grounded in evidence about what teachers are doing, and then a focus on professional learning, like creating opportunities for teachers to grow that are differentiated and based in their own data. All right. And so that's the piece that we're going to home in on. And what I will say is that even though our study is really highlighting this piece of what's often termed instructional leadership, we don't call it instructional leadership because this area I think is more specific. It's really about those individual interactions. That even though that is really calling out the importance of those instructional interactions for teacher effectiveness and for school growth, what it doesn't completely, it tells us a lot about the what, it doesn't tell us about the how. So it doesn't tell us what instructional leadership should look like in terms of day-to-day responsibilities. It tells us the general areas that principals and their leadership teams should be focusing on. But what we don't really know is exactly where the areas of focus and the how should be in leading and teaching and learning. And I think that's the real benefit of what Emily and her team have done in terms of trying to pull that together is helping us get in a bit more into that how.
Thank you for that overview. Can we go back to the graphic with the framework on it for just a second? Thank you. Yeah, I think the how and also the who becomes a focus, like within the school, who is doing what, and we'll get into that in much more detail. But I remember asking you in our first conversation, one question that I'll ask now, and then we'll open it up to others. One thing that I thought was interesting is that you had collaboration and professional learning communities as like a bubble that was separate than the bubble of instructionally focused interactions with teachers. Can you say more about the reasoning there, or sort of anything from the research that we should know about there? And just how you see, like, are those instructional interactions or are they different?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly can be. They're certainly related to instruction. We called them out and pull. So the first bucket is really focusing on the instructional interactions between leaders and teachers, and thinking specifically about data observation, feedback. You could think about professional learning community. You could think about facilitating collaboration as being another strategy for improving teacher instruction. We pulled it out because there is really a growing literature on the importance of collaboration specifically that really highlights how much kids benefit when adults and buildings can work together. Because the problems that students are dealing with, the problems of teaching can be really complex ones. But there's a lot of expertise in the building that can be harnessed. So some of that is thinking about the harnessing of the expertise from the leadership team, which is one way of thinking about bucket one. Whereas bucket three is more horizontal. It's about thinking about how to harness the expertise and the insights of other teachers. But there's a role. The reason it's in the leadership behaviors bucket, there's a role for high quality leadership in facilitating collaboration and facilitating that work for teachers, creating structures for teachers to be able to do that, role modeling.
Yeah.
Creating the space for it, but also creating the structures and the protocols and the expectations around what collaboration should look like.
Yeah, we'll get into some of what we found in the field of what people perceive professional learning communities to be. So useful. All right, let's open up for any questions. We have just about 5 minutes for direct questions for Jason now. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat. We have one about leadership content knowledge and prerequisite skill level.
Yes. So certainly leadership content knowledge matters a lot. The sort of understanding what the basics of leadership are. I mean, that's a lot of what we're trying to do in leadership preparation, right? And also in service training. it wasn't a specific focus of ours, but it's almost certainly a background here, right? Like it's driving a lot of what people are able to do in executing these behaviors or in these domains of behavior well. Um, there's a question here about whether the study focused on building teacher capacity to lead around instruction. We did not. That was not our specific focus, in part because the specific charge we were given in writing the report was the linkage between principles and student outcomes. That was the starting point. Building teacher capacity comes up, right? It's one of the strategies here. Part of professional learning community is about building teacher capacity, although not necessarily to lead around instruction, but almost certainly that's important. It just wasn't one of our focal points here. Can you speak about how involved successful principals are in school operations? School operations is really important, and I think gets less attention sometimes than maybe it should. It falls, you could think about it falling more in that fourth bucket. There's a whole lot that I could say here. I think that there's a little bit of a balance for good principals because operations are clearly important, but I think principals have to be careful to not let too much of their time be devoted to operational issues that distracts them from other important investments they need to make in the core business of what a school does, which is teaching and learning. And so there's a lot of emerging strategies around delegation and thinking about harnessing others in the building for leaders to figure out what are the pieces of operations I have to really take on myself and how much I can give over to others. And that is part of what thinking strategically in bucket 4 looks like.
Jason, why don't we I'm just mining across some of the questions
Sure.
also coming in. Can you speak a little bit to time allocation? Because I know you have done some other research on that. And then I have one other question, and I want to just let everyone know questions we don't get to, we are going to address in a follow-up blog. So feel free to keep putting your questions in, but we're going to focus on those two for the moment.
Yeah, so time allocation. So when we think about managing resources strategically, I think time is one of the resources that is one of the most important ones we have, and one that we often don't think enough about. And you can think about time in two ways. One is the way I was just talking about it, which is the leader's time and how the leader makes calls about how their own time and attention needs to be invested to pursue their school's goals. But then more broadly, there's thinking about the school's time, thinking about the school's schedule. And one important place to think about that is around teacher collaboration, right? So if you want your grade level teams to be able to collaborate, well, you have to create time structures to make that happen. If there isn't common planning time, for example, and collaboration then gets pushed to after school, well, then it doesn't happen in the same way as if you build time in for it to happen during the school day. And so thinking strategically about time and time as a resource, I think is one of the most important let's say, orientations that an effective leader can have. What was the
Did
second
you
one?
have any quantifiables on that? Like, percent of time spent on instruction differentiating outcomes? Like, is there any sort of bottom line data there?
I don't know that there is a good one about percent of time spent on instruction. I mean, we have good time use studies that suggest that something in the neighborhood of 15 to 20% of the typical leader's time is spent on instructional tasks, and a
Yeah.
general sense that it should be quite a bit higher than that. But also studies of sort of what the time demands of the environment suggest that like principals
Yeah.
they cannot reallocate their time to make that number higher as much as people would like to. So, how much time is going to be partly a function of who else is involved in that game with you,
Yeah.
what we're going to move
Yeah.
on to. But I think the baseline point is thinking strategically about time and using time to its best uses. And we
Yeah.
strategically about that is really important.
And balancing that with realism about the other functions people have
Exactly.
to balance. Okay, my last question for you before we move into the study is, what are your personal feelings about the term instructional leadership?
It's not my favorite.
Why?
I think instructional leadership okay, so instructional leadership is a phrase we've used in the field for about 40 years. I think at the time that it came along, it was really valuable because the idea of instructional leadership was really about shifting the way that we think about school leadership, that what the school principal did wasn't primarily operational and administrative, that what a high quality principal should be doing is focusing more on instruction, on learning, orienting their times, and the ways that we were just talking about, making those investments around instruction. And I think that was really valuable. That was a shift that needed to happen, and that's taken us, we've been riding that shift now for 30 or 40 years. The reason I don't like it as a phrase is you can ask 100 people what instructional leadership means, and you will get 100 different definitions. So it is a phrase that, I mean, people throw it around all the time. It's very commonplace. We talk about instructional leadership in the field always, and I read lots of even research articles that's the opening sentence has the word instructional leadership in it. There's never any definition. There's never any follow-up to say this is what we mean by instructional leadership in this study. And when I talk to people on the ground, it's the same. I find in school districts that there are general notions of instructional leadership, right? There's ideas that principals should be involved in that core business of instruction, but what that looks like is often assumed. It's implicit. And the definitions are going to be different from place to place. And so that's why I don't love the phrase. I think it is too elastic. We've used it for a long time without a lot of specificity necessarily about what we mean. And we need specificity. If you're going to move the work, we have to know what we're collectively what we're talking
Yeah.
about. We often
Yeah. Yeah. Super helpful. Okay. Thank you for that primer for us. And I know we're going to call you in to comment as we go through the findings we have here. So it is conversations like this that led us to think about, and as I said, the pattern of working across hundreds of schools and noticing that people felt like they needed to be instructional leaders, but that the answers we were getting on what that means felt a bit ranging, and that that we saw that have implications for the kind of support teachers were getting. That led us to design a very small study to understand to really document this range of perception and to dig into some of the core activities that are commonly understood to be part of instructional leadership, to understand what people perceive even those to mean. So our goal was to understand how principals and school system leaders thought about what it meant to be an instructional leader, both the tasks and responsibilities and the way those would be distributed across teams. We saw some questions about distributed leadership, and that's another term that we heard a lot, like we need to make sure we're distributing leadership, but we also heard perception of what that meant to be a lot of different things. And so we wanted to understand really what is that variation. And then our secondary goal was to, from those interviews, map promising models of ways that think about how to distribute the work. And we call this the who does what. So there's like the what of what people are doing, and then the who does what that we wanted to really understand better. And we did focus around 3 activity sets that we've seen schools tend to organize in their support for teachers. One is collaborative planning, which we are here looking at from more of that instructional lens. The second is observation and feedback. And then the third is data practices. And just a little bit on the methodology here. We did match pair interviews with principal supervisors and elementary and middle school principals. We did not focus on high school in this stage of the work because we find high school to be sort of more different when it comes to the demands on the role. And we wanted to understand variation in a narrower context. We conducted these interviews just in one state because we wanted similar policy and funding context so that the things that were driving the variation were not externalities. So we did conduct this here in Tennessee. And participants were selected from school systems and schools serving at least 40% of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch. The schools had on the Tennessee value added assessment, which is based just on state student achievement outcomes, a level 3, 4, or 5. And we had 17 school systems, including 9 traditional districts and 8 charter management organizations. So north of 30 interviews. And the interviews were conducted by former superintendents with a guided interview script, and then we had secondary analysis, and Dr. Grissom did sort of tertiary analysis on our analysis as we went. And I don't think I used tertiary there correctly, but I'm going to go with it. So what we're going to do is talk about what we found, first of all, in like an overarching sense, and then we're going to dig into the models. And I'm going to breeze through the overarching findings without spending too much time here. And then we are going to dig into the models more. And I don't think anyone on this call is going to find these findings surprising. But Jason, tell me if I'm wrong. I do think this is the first time these are being documented. And so we think there's some value in us like sort of stating the facts, even if our spidey sense would have suggested this was happening anyway. So finding one, as you said in your feelings about the term instructional leadership, we found that to a person interviewed, every single person identified as an instructional leader. No one said, I am not the instructional leader, and not a single person defined that the same way. And the range of how people described what instructional leadership should include varied somewhat considerably. We have a fuller depiction in the appendix, but there was different emphasis placed on different parts of say like the standards for leadership. And there was a different sense of definition of what was included within instruction and what is operational. People didn't even have the same definition of that. Two, leaders not only understood instructional leadership to mean different things, but when we pressed in to ask people questions about collaborative planning, observation and feedback, and data practices, they understood those activities as to mean different things as well. So we found the broadest range of interpretation for collaborative planning. There was a very broad sense, and there was high degrees of difference in what people defined that to mean. We found the narrowest range of meaning for observation and feedback when it was referencing formal teacher evaluation, which in Tennessee, there's a fairly muscular teacher evaluation requirement. And so respondents would say things like, well, when it comes to observation and feedback, what I know I need to do are A, B, and C, and they would basically describe the policy. When we pressed on informal observation and feedback outside of evaluation, there was a wide range of interpretation about what that should look like or mean. Interpretations of data practices were also broad. They clustered around two different categories of interpretation. One that was loosely organizing support for students who need additional help. This might fall in like a policy umbrella of RTI or MTSS, but essentially we need to use data to understand who's not on track and to make sure we get support for them. And then there was a second category of meaning interpreted here that was more around student learning data to adjust instructional plans. We need teachers to look at data so that they change either the scope and sequence, how they group students, or the time they're putting on task for certain topics. And we had indication in the interviews that the variation was not only across systems, with different systems having different understandings of those, but even within schools in the same system. So for example, when we asked the system leader questions about collaborative planning, they would say things like, well, different schools approach it different ways, indicating that this is not just system to system variation. Finding three is that we found that school-based instructional roles other than the principal had a very wide range of titles and responsibilities. So every leader we spoke to reported having an instructional leadership team. So like word is out on the importance of that, and would often cite the importance of distributed leadership. Most of the schools we talked to had school-based roles involved in teacher support other than just the principal. Assistant principals, coaches, sometimes teacher leaders. The titles and functions of those school-based instructional roles varied quite considerably. So I think across 17 systems, we had 10 different titles that were reported for those roles. Sometimes it was like acronyms like um, MLD or TLD, like sometimes it was coach. And we saw variation where different people or different titles were sometimes doing the same role, or the same title was often doing different roles. And this variation was also noted to be within district as well as across district. So a district leader would say, we have coaches at every school, but the way they're used in different schools is quite different school to school. So those are the 3-level findings, like kind of at the highest level. As I said, I doubt you will be surprised by any of these, but we would love to hear from folks just as a moment to pause and engage. In your experience, what challenges do these trends cause? We're not actually documenting these as good or bad. We're not saying this is a problem. We're just documenting what is, but we are curious to hear from you where you think these are challenges that limit impact for leaders or cause systemic issues as a field. We'll give people a minute or two to chime in with thoughts. Thanks for starting us, Erin. Yeah, I'm seeing challenges of studying impact. I bet that resonates, Jason. Yeah, it makes it difficult for us to talk about what works. It's, yep, role-specific professional learning challenges, transparent expectation. Yeah. I think it also causes this, I'm seeing somebody use the word friction. Like that was one of the things that I really took away from reviewing all of these interview notes, is just how much time people end up having to spend explaining what they are meaning, or how many problems are caused by people thinking that they mean the same thing, but then actually discovering that they mean different things by it. And I do think we've seen some comments just about pipelines and the idea of like, how are we preparing people for the next set of roles? And it's when everything is so contextual, it is very hard to do so. We didn't document this as a top line finding because it wasn't as targeted a focus of our interview questions, and we wanted to sort of hold a bar for that. But we did notice in the way people described the choices they were making, a real sense of like, well, I'm doing this because this is what I saw when I was a teacher, or I'm doing this because this is what I saw when I was a teacher and I didn't want to replicate that. So there was really a sense of the learning around this, which I know, Jason, is a focus of your study now. Like the way people are learning about how to structure roles seems to be very anecdotal and very much informed by just their prior experience. We didn't hear anybody sort of referencing any models or research that informed thinking here. Yeah, I love that comment, Heather. Just I think the other confusion, which we're very much finding as we apply these findings, is that it becomes hard to, if you're in central office, to organize support if the context is so different school to school. All right, so let's get into the models. And as I shared, the secondary goal of the study was to sort of lift what seems to be like promising ways to think about the what or the who does what. And on the question of the what, we didn't have a sort of study design that allows us to say people who focused on these activity sets have better outcomes. But what we did notice is the way people described the activity set varied considerably in clarity and in the specificity of expectation. So what we would lift as the promising model for the what is honestly just being clear. And just to give one sort of like point counterpoint example, here are two quotes about collaborative planning, one of which feels significantly clearer than the other. I'll let people read that for a second. So because we cannot rely on our language to convey clear meaning, the way school leaders and districts describe what they expect needs to sort of define the very terms that they are using. And that becomes something that we do think has some actionable implications for leaders. Yes, we will share the slide deck and the recording. On this question of who does what, we looked at the org charts very closely for every school and school system that we interviewed. And it's really a fascinating thing to do, I will just say. Org charts I find fascinating, and the way people varied them and the reasoning that went into them, I think was really, really interesting to understand. What we did is we screened those org charts for 3 criteria. And this is a bit of us editorializing what we think matters. So I'll just be transparent about that. We were looking for org charts where it was very clear who does what. We were looking for org charts where the coverage was comprehensive. So if they said we care about these 3 things, you could tell who was doing those 3 things in the org chart, and where everyone had a more knowledgeable other. So whoever was, I'm going to use the word managing their work, monitoring the quality, ensuring it was happening, and supporting their coaching and development, knew enough to do so. And when we screened for those, all of the remaining org charts mapped to 3 models of distribution of who does what. And we are going to show you what those are here. And to be upfront and transparent, these models are like a draft. They are a starting point for conversation. And we are currently working with schools to sort of apply this and help them come up with their version of these models. But we hope that they provide a practical starting point to think about how choices other people are making, given that there's not very much information published on this. So the models we've named, 1 is deliver, 2 is coach, and 3 is designate. And we are deliberately not using the word delegate for any of these because all of them involve delegating something. And that's not kind of what we want to highlight. We want to highlight how you think about entering through the principal role, what the principal does, and then the implications that has for what other people do. So model 1 is focused on the principal executing personally. So they are the person delivering the instructional support activity. So if we're talking about data practices and there's a data meeting structure, the principal is the one facilitating that. If there's an expectations for observation and feedback, the principal is the one doing that observation and feedback. And in the schools that leaned into this model, they typically were delegating non-instructional responsibilities to someone else. So we saw examples of a school operations manager that had a, a larger role in facilities management and parent engagement that allowed for that focus on time. This requires principals to know a lot about a lot of subjects and a lot of key activities around instruction. And the challenge here is sustainability and time. It is just an incredible load on the principals. But this is model one. I should say we did see variation across some of the models. So you might have multiple models in play in the same system or school, and that could vary by content or activity. So you could say, well, we're model one on data meetings. Like our principal's the one who really does those, but on observation and planning, we're in a different model. So there was variation and permutations within. Model two was coach. So the principal effectively coaches someone else to execute. So the principal leads by selecting, managing, and coaching and holding others accountable for the work of delivering on those instructional support activities. And this requires the principals to both know what that instructional leadership activity should look like and have the skills to coach the adults to improve in their delivery. The challenge in this model that we heard is the demands on the on the principal's instructional knowledge is just very high. And model three, which is probably the most controversial of the three models that we have lifted, we are calling designate. And in this model, the principal identifies, selects, and empowers another person to lead on instructional leadership activities, while they tend to focus on other aspects of the role and fully back that designated leader to support the conditions they require for those activities. I would say the reason this is controversial is because some people feel like this shouldn't be something that we are considering under the realm of instructional leadership. But I want to be clear about what we found here, because we did find that there were systems where the superintendent deeply cared about instruction and instructional excellence, but also felt like either due to legacy community expectations or the folks that are in the roles that the principals were very strong at community engagement and operations, and that is what they were expected to be good at. And they created an AP position to support instructional leadership. The key here, though, is those APs did not solely report to the principals. They also reported to central office. And that's how they met that more knowledgeable other criteria. We lifted this because we did hear regularly about examples where there was this sort of need for practicality around what the principal could do and a need to find a model that could work, even if the principal wasn't able to spend as much time on task or didn't have the instructional leadership depth in certain areas. So, for example, there was a school where the principal said, look, I really understand literacy, but I am not as confident on math. And so I've named my AP to be lead on supporting math for observation and planning. And I'm going to support the conditions that they need on that, but that's not where I'm going to be leading. That would be an example of a designate model. And the key to making sure that that works is if the principal isn't confident on math, what is the more knowledgeable other support that they are providing for that AP? Often this could be a district support role, but needing to make sure that it wasn't a delegate without the support of the more knowledgeable other example, because those were not examples that we would lift as meeting those criteria. One challenge in this model is the communications and coordination. There's a high risk of sort of mom and dad dynamics here in terms of the principal either not supporting their designee, and sort of staff pitting them against each other, or dynamics with district office becoming complex. So it's definitely a complicated model, but it was a model that we saw in practice. So let us pause there, because usually there's a lot of questions about these models. We'll spend about 5 minutes on questions, and then we will go to implications. I can re-show slide 3 for questions. Thanks for asking. This one? Thank you for these questions. Okay. Did we notice any patterns in terms of school size or tenure? Nothing that we could say like with confidence. I have qualitatively heard people talk about feeling a need to be the deliverer when they have just started, either as a principal or in a school. Like, I used to be at a different school, and now I've moved here, and I really want to set the tone and set the bar. But that is by no means a documented pattern. And then I think, in America, our school size tends to control our budget. And so the staffing allocations do vary based on size, in many cases. But we have seen examples of small schools that used all 3 of these models. And I've seen examples of bigger schools that use both 2 and 3. There's typically a delivery crunch when you get to certain sizes, which I think is part of why high school is different here. I'm looking at questions about efficacy. We do not have any evidence to say which of these is more effective than others. And what I would also offer is, I think we do know as a field that context matters. And what we found in the high level findings is that right now, role design is nothing but contextual. Like, it is just context is the only thing sort of driving the role design. And I think our sense is that we shouldn't aspire to try to get to one right model, but instead, what are 3, 4, 5 workable models that allow for definition, allow for more clear role support, but still allow people to adapt to context. And so it's not currently our aspiration to sort of go out and type 40 schools to these different models and then test which ones work. I think it's more so our aspiration to understand, when applied to real contexts, do these models hold up? Are there other models that actually emerge to be useful? And then in what context would they make sense so that people have that choice? Yes, the study and its findings are available for download. I'm seeing some questions and thoughts around the designate role, which we do hear in conversations often. And yeah, I mean, I understand. I had a superintendent say to me, like, designate is not an option in my district. Like, I refuse to put that on the table. And I understand why a leader would choose to do that. But I also think there are contexts we're finding it can work in. And there's always something that may need a designate solution, like something that just in a constrained time climate, the principal's not going to be able to focus on. So I hope at least the lessons from designate can be useful to think about what may be done in those contexts. But it's certainly not a simple model. I very much agree. Um, Now, let us go on. I'm just watching time. Let us go on to implications. But actually, before I do, Jason, anything you want to offer here? Anything that surprised you from the models or that you kind of noticed about them?
No, I would point out, I mean, I was reading the comments as well and just want to underscore one of the comments that showed up in the chat about sort of the needs for having different models and having some recognition that there are different models because of the level of expectation that we place on school leaders and what they need to be able to accomplish. And you know, the level of that level of expectation has gotten to be so high in terms of what we are putting on the shoulders of school leaders every day without ever in 30 years taking anything off the plate of school leaders. But I think it makes it really, I think, resonates to think about some alternative ways of trying to accomplish at a high level, you know, this really important investing in instruction and what's happening in classrooms.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think the superintendent's concern who said like no designate in my system was I want teaching and learning to be the focus and I want my leaders to lead on that. And I do appreciate that perspective and point of view. I'm just reading the comments and sort of wanting to lift that. Um, and I think that's why there is this interaction between like the what and the who does what. I think we need in the work we're doing with schools now to try to apply these findings and find like systematic ways to help schools apply these findings. We are finding they have to get very clear on the what first. Like, what do you want every teacher to be getting by way of support? And what does that mean? And like, even down to rank ordering that. Like, if you can't have everything, what are the top 2 to 3 things that you're going to protect the most? And then how do you design roles to ensure those things happen? And I think that that's maybe one other observation I'll say from the models is, I mean, even this paper was titled to be about the principal role. And Jason, I know you've spoken to the fact that the research community can be a bit siloed in terms of there's like people who focus on principles, but different people who focus on coaching or different people who focus on intervention. And I think what we're finding in the application effort is like it is just all connected. And the design of the principal role does impact the design of the coach role, which then impacts the design of the teacher leader role, which then impacts the district leader role. And I worry we don't have enough research that looks across those right now to be helpful to practitioners, because it does feel like it's a package undertaking and it's very hard to just sort of pull a single role.
Well, I mean, the corollary is like how we ask teachers to backwards plan. You know, you're thinking about a lesson, and we have to do that from a system design perspective. Like you think about what goal you're trying to achieve. The goal is teacher support. Then what is the system that needs to be put into place to get you that thing you need? And that might not be exactly the same system in every place because the needs are different, the skills are going to be different, the resources are going to be different, and we need to have some clarity about what the possibilities are.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much agree. All right. So let us close with implications and we will let you get on to your next meetings and tasks. We think there are some immediate implications, and then I should say this is part 1, and there will be a part 2 paper that we release as we've been learning from applying these models. So we hope this will be a conversation we can continue in community. Immediately, it feels like the implications for principals are like, don't take for granted that instructional leadership means the same thing to you and to others. Start by getting clear on what that means. And I do think entering through this question of what support do all teachers need is sometimes an easier entry point than the question of like, what does it mean for me to be an instructional leader? And then over communicate with clarity exactly what is meant by this. And then try to get clear on the who does what. And sometimes those staffing decisions are made at the school level, sometimes they're at the district level, but really look at these models or look at other examples to say, what's the relationship between roles? I think the biggest implications of our findings are for school system leaders, because so much of role design is sort of linchpinned at that level. So what does that mean for you as a district? Are you going to have one district-wide approach to role distribution? Do you think you'll have different models for different schools? What should those look like for you in your context? And then making sure that the way you think about hiring, onboarding, and principal evaluations reflect those choices. We also think there are implications for state leaders. States do set things like standards for instructional leadership. Often they are at a 60,000-foot altitude to try to sort of transcend context. But are there ways for states to step in here and provide more practical examples of what models schools could consider? And that can happen from learning from what is happening already. And then thinking about for other initiatives, whether it's science of reading, et cetera, what does that mean for instructional leaders, and being very concrete in those. So we'll wrap here. We do hope you'll share some feedback on this very short survey. We have a QR code here. In this next phase of the project, we really would be delighted to be in a community around this learning. My email is there. Please feel free to share any thoughts that this conversation sparked for you that you weren't able to put in the comments. And then we partner with schools, school systems, and states to try to clarify and strengthen instructional leadership. And if there are ways we can be helpful to you, please let us know. You can reach out to engagement@instructionpartners.org. Jason, any final thoughts as we close?
No, I think this is so valuable to think about the different ways that we're organizing these, key activities in schools. So I really commend your team for really doing the hard work to think about this stuff and lift it up and think about how to move it forward.
Well, and I know you're doing some exciting research on how principals learn. We'll be excited to learn from that. And thank you for all of your incredible contributions to the field. It definitely feels like a backs of giants moment to be able to know you and the work you've done, and then try to extend it.
Exciting.
Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all.